Welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood-Coleman, the Chief Editorial Officer and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week the featured country is France, where the second round of the presidential election stood not just as a referendum on the future of path for France, but also as a test for democratic order and Western alliances. In the first round of the crowded presidential field a month before, incumbent centrist President Emmanuel Macron got the plurality of the vote share and was set to contest the second round against the far-right extremist Marine Le Pen, who barely edged out the leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The second round would be between Macron and Le Pen. Polling data did not depict a clear forecast. While some survey data suggested that Macron would best Le Pen in the second round, other polls showed a dead heat. The outcome would likely depend on where supporters of the other unsuccessful candidates in the first round would migrate. Would they go to Le Pen or Macron? Or would they stay home? Le Pen would benefit from Zemmour's hard right-wing and xenophobic base. On the other side of the equation, there was a clear clarion call from many of the unsuccessful candidates in the first round not to allow Le Pen into the Élysée Palace. The Socialists, the Greens, the Communists, and even the defeated Conservative made clear that the vote must be for Macron. On April 20th, 2022, Macron and Le Pen faced each other in their only televised debate ahead of the second round of the election. Making clear his difference with Le Pen, a Eurosceptic and a Russian asset, Macron said that the election was a referendum on Europe and a moment of clear choice. Macron wasted little time in criticizing Le Pen for her ties to the Kremlin, her support for the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and for benefiting from a Russian bank loan to fund her party. Macron lambasted Le Pen, saying, "You're speaking to your banker when you speak to Russia." In the past, Le Pen urged France's exit from the European Union, a position that would no doubt please Vladimir Putin of Russia. On election day, April 24th, 2022, the French citizenry went to the polls to cast their ballots in the second decisive round of the French presidential contest. Once the polls closed, it was apparent that Macron had overperformed expectations. The incumbent president was on a glide path to decisive election victory, soundly defeating Marine Le Pen. Indeed, Emmanuel Macron of La République En Marche had secured 58.6% of the vote share, strongly beating Marine Le Pen of the National Front, who took 41.4%. Macron's victory has rested on consolidated support from the opposition ranks from the left to the centre-right, with those who supported first-round candidates such as socialist Anne Hidalgo, the Greens leader Yannick Jadot, the hard leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the communist Fabien Roussel, and the conservative Valérie Pécresse, closing ranks to vote against the extremist Le Pen in the runoff. In so doing, Macron had not only won convincingly another 5 years in the Élysée Palace as French president, but he'd also secured a clear mandate to advance his policy agenda. The next test for France would come in the form of parliamentary elections to be held in June 2022. Going into those elections, Macron would have a parliamentary majority. After those elections, however, he would need that parliamentary majority to advance his agenda legislatively. A president without a friendly parliament would be forced into a scenario known as political cohabitation, which could potentially weaken him. Meanwhile, Le Pen tried to take solace in her defeat, saying that it was nonetheless a victory of sorts for her party. But her far-right rival, Eric Zemmour, who had backed her in the runoff, had a very different view of Le Pen's defeat. He said, "It's the 8th time the Le Pen name has been hit by defeat." At the international level, victory for Macron was met with a sigh of relief from Western leaders in Europe and across the Atlantic in the United States. European leaders welcomed Macron's re-election in light of Le Pen's agenda to weaken NATO and remove France from the European Union. The United States was also welcoming Macron's re-election as a victory for democracy over rising authoritarianism. Another dimension to the Macron victory was the war taking place on European soil, launched by Russia unprovoked against Ukraine. Not surprisingly, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had urged French voters to back Macron, congratulated his true friend, that's a quote, and anticipated a strong and united Europe. A strong and united Europe would be needed to support Ukraine in its quest to defend itself from Russian invaders. Macron's defeat of Le Pen, an admirer of the Russian president, was also a proxy political defeat for Vladimir Putin. Indeed, it was a proxy rebuke of both Russia and Putin's ambitions in Europe. The corollary was that Macron's victory served to augment the existing Northern Atlantic security apparatus. Meanwhile, for his part, the re-elected President Macron made history as the first sitting French president to be re-elected in 20 years. The Slovenian parliamentary election took place on the same day as the second round of the French presidential election. While the election was very much a referendum on Slovenia's future path, it was also a test of liberal democracy in Europe. The ruling conservative Slovenia Democratic Party, led by right-wing populist Prime Minister Janez Janša, would be seeking re-election, with Janša being an ally of Viktor Orban in Hungary and an admirer of both Donald Trump in the United States and Vladimir Putin in Russia. A Janša victory would be a blow to the West's efforts to rebuke Russia. It would also be a victory for rising populist authoritarianism. But such an end was not to come to pass. Instead, the newly formed liberal ecologist freedom movement, led by Robert Golog, took the plurality of votes. The 10 percentage point delta separating the freedom movement from the incumbent prime minister's party meant that Janša had been soundly defeated. It should be noted that Golob's newly formed freedom movement had championed green energy transition and sustainable development as a policy prescription, a sharp contrast to the nationalist populist rhetoric of Janša. In this way, Golob and his freedom movement, new entrants to the political sphere in Slovenia, would be positioned to form a new government. It was likely that he would form a government with some of the smaller left-leaning parties. A week earlier, the second round of the presidential election was held in East Timor. The contest was between incumbent President Francisco Guterres, a former resistance fighter and the independence leader, and Nobel laureate José Ramos Horta. Once the polls closed and the votes were counted, it was clear that José Ramos Horta had secured a landslide victory with over 62% of the vote share. Francisco Guterres took close to 38%. Ramos Horta, who served as president from 2007 to 2012, was thus set to become president once again. He was awarded a Nobel Prize for Peace in 1996 for his efforts to facilitate a just and peaceful solution to the conflict in East Timor. In 2008, during his tenure as president, he survived an assassination attempt. He would be inaugurated into power on May 20th, 2022, the 20th anniversary of East Timor's independence from Indonesia, which carried out a brutal occupation of the former Portuguese colony for almost a quarter of a century. Finally, I'd like to note that as the war continues to rage in Ukraine, United States Secretary of State Blinken and United States Secretary of Defense Austin met with President Zelensky in Kyiv. On the agenda was the matter of further military assistance to Ukraine as well as other aid. It marked the first high-level talks between the Ukrainian leader and a delegation from the Biden administration since February 19, 2022 in Munich, Germany. On that day, just 5 days before the Russian invasion, Vice President Kamala Harris met with President Zelensky. In this high-level visit to the Ukrainian capital in April 2022, it was expected that President Zelensky would press Blinken and Austin for more powerful weapons to be used against Russia in that country's campaign for the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. In the background of these developments was an announced meeting between the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. The United Nations chief would also meet with President Zelensky in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. While Guterres has described the trip as aspirational on the peace front, Zelensky has cast it as a mistake, particularly because Guterres was set to visit Russia before Ukraine. To this end, Zelensky posed the following question: why? To hand over signals from Russia? What should we look for? Referring to one of Moscow's main thoroughfares, Zelensky added, "There are no corpses scattered on the Kutuzovsky Prospect." Indeed, a high-level visit to Moscow from the United Nations Secretary General was sure to be used for Russian propaganda purposes. Subscribers can read more about these and other stories at the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. I'd also like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunsets in the Graveyard of Empires, available for purchase from the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. Thank you for your time. Have a great day. And remember, more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.